Welcome back to Psychobabble. I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and this little video is going to be a bit of an addendum to my previous video, in which I shared my reflections 10 years after experiencing discrimination and persecution in graduate school by LGBTQ activism. And there's a section in my original recording that, just for the sake of time, I cut out and ended up on the cutting room floor just because it was already long enough. But I was reading from the ending of my journal article in which I wrote about my story, where I was asked to give some advice to potential or future or current graduate school students, particularly students in graduate programs for counseling or psychology or clinical social work, for example, marriage and family therapy. And what tips would I give to them? And so that was one of the things the editors had asked me to include when I was writing my journal article. What advice would you give to potential students? I'm like, well, it's not going to be good. so there's this little part. Even after I did my video, someone emailed me and asked me for some tips, like, well, what would you look for in a graduate school program? In fact, let me read some of the tips I gave this person. One question I was asked was, how would I determine if a school's training would be considered robust? Or perhaps the school does not matter as much if clinical training is mainly done outside of classes in certification programs or with the internship supervisor. This is a good question. It's something I wish I would have known before going into graduate school. I thought you go to graduate school and you get all the training you need to be a therapist, to actually start doing work. And it's the common story I hear from people is actually, no, you just get the basics. I'm like, why am I not getting the basics when I did my bachelor's in psychology? I feel like I barely learned anything in my bachelor's. So I was expecting when I do my master's, I'd be really learning some true clinical skills and interventions. And so, in general, I think there's a problem with the mental health, the academia for master's programs. We're not training people enough in what to actually do in session. But in particular, my school, I think, was very deficient. We did have a Techniques of Counseling 1, which was just basically like therapeutic interviewing and Rogerian skills, super basic stuff that I think should be taught in undergraduates. And then because it was supposed to be a psychodynamic school, in Techniques of Counseling 2, we were supposed to have been taught more object relations, but it was not very well done. And I know other object relations therapists who do a much better job, and of course I was trained by a psychoanalyst and he was not happy with the training I was getting in my classes. Like, you're not being taught anything psychodynamic, let alone psychoanalytic. So this is one of my soapbox issues here. So first off, something I wish I would have known about Chestnut Hill before I went in was their admissions rate. And really, even if I did know it, it wouldn't have mattered to me too much at the time. Now I think it does matter to me. A lower admission rate is a sign that the program is likely of a higher caliber. Thus, they won't dumb down the material to the lowest common denominator. So I think that's what they kind of do. That's my impression. I would also ask if the classes include trainings in specific types of interventions. For example, my trauma courses mentioned EMDR, but why wasn't it taught? Why weren't we trained in EMDR? I don't understand why that's not one of the standard things you're taught when EMDR is like the gold standard, for the most part, in trauma therapy. I have to do an additional training in EMDR after graduating. When I'm telling people, oh, I'm a trauma trained therapist, I did the trauma track. Well, how can I say I'm a trauma therapist when I'm not trained in any of the actual interventions used by most clinicians who do trauma therapy? So I went on and did a really good trauma course with Ricky Greenwald's group. It was a very thorough one. It's not like a one weekend trauma training or EMDR training. It was like 2 weekends, 2 full days, and then another weekend, like over the course of 3 months. So they gave us time to practice with our clients, do recordings, bring them in, get consultation. Very thorough. And that included both training in EMDR, basic training in it, and also flash training. Now, this said, I do know other people who got EMDR training in their graduate programs as part of their standard coursework. So it's not impossible for some schools to do this. I really wish they would. Like, train more people in actual interventions. The other question he asked was, what would you recommend to avoid the hurdles that I faced? A counseling program from a Christian university? Or would a social work program be less affiliated with some of the governing bodies you mentioned? So that last part made me laugh. Okay, so here's my answer. Sadly, things have only gotten worse since I finished grad school. And if you don't know this, you really should know. Social work is the most liberal, most progressive left wing of all the helping professions of psychology, psychiatry, marriage and family therapy, regular counseling. Social work is the most left wing. They breed activists in social work. So no, I would not want to go into a social work program. There was a time I wanted to. I was thinking about it because it would open up a little more opportunities. Quick interjection: there are some Christian social work programs that I would definitely recommend, such as Indiana Wesleyan University, uh, Cedarville University. I think they just have undergrad, though. I'm not sure if they have a master's in clinical social work. But there are some Christian ones that I would check out if you are interested in social work as a Christian. So I don't want to pan all social work. Just know what you're getting into. All right. Which I'm going to say in a moment anyway. But because of the state of things, looking back, 10 years later, I look back at where I was then, how bad it was then, and then I look at what I'm hearing about how the state of grad school now. I I would say you might have to sacrifice clinical quality to preserve your sanity. So even though on one hand I wish that grad school programs would do more clinical interventions, be more robust in their trainings, if I had to go to a secular program to get that type of training, I don't think it would be worth it. I can get that training afterwards. It's extra expensive to do it that way, but because now the ideology is so strong in the psych world, it's just not worth it. I probably would now go to a Christian university. See, I went to Chestnut Hill because I at least thought they would be tolerable of my Christian views as a, you know, quote unquote Catholic university. I knew that most Catholic universities aren't really Catholic, that they're Catholic in name only, but I figured they at least would be tolerant of someone coming from a biblical Christian worldview. Uh, but I was wrong about that, of course. So I was open to going to a secular program as long as they were, I understood there would be disagreements with my perspective on things, but I figured in the university level you would have dialogue about these disagreements. No, it's not like that anymore, especially not when it comes to LGBTQ issues, sexuality, gender. There's You have one party line, you have to toe it. So if you're watching this and you are a Christian, then yeah, I would say find a Christian university. And even then you got to be careful. So check to see, do they have DEI departments? Do they uh, take a side A or a side B approach to homosexuality and gender identity issues? So you might want to go to a seminary. Actually, I would actually recommend getting as much biblical scholarship training and theological and philosophical training as you can, so you can be grounded in your worldview. And then you might have to get that robust clinical training afterwards by going to extra trainings in, say, EMDR or reintegrative therapy, which I teach. So if you're interested in the work I do, reach out to me, reach out to Reintegrative Therapy Association, go to reintegrativetherapy.com and ask, hey, I'd like to do training with Andrew. I'm the guy who does our trainings. So yes, you're going to learn a bunch of trauma interventions and approaches to dealing with unwanted sexual arousal templates and sexual addiction. So yeah, you got to go after grad school to get some of the more robust, in-depth training. And make sure you do clinical supervision. Obviously, you need that to get your license, but continue doing supervision even after you get your license. Most therapists have an inflated view of how good they are as a therapist, and so they plateau and they just do the continuing education that they need to maintain their license, and they don't really consult enough with other therapists and colleagues and mentors. Have a clinical mentor. Have a group of colleagues that you talk about cases with. even after getting your license. It's important. You're going to grow. You need to be challenged and grow. So, that's some of my tips off the top of my head right now, but let me now proceed with sharing the remainder of the video that I got cut out for the sake of time. And I want to plug a couple books that have been inspirational for me when I was a teenager, and also like after getting married and I'm a young adult. And that were some books by Scott Peck. So The Road Less Traveled, very famous book. I've mentioned it in multiple videos already, especially that first line that's so famous: life is difficult. And it's the denial of that reality that makes life more difficult. That is at the root to so much of our disorders and our mental anguish. I mean, this really, he's echoing Freud in a lot of ways, because Freud always said that denial is the culprit for all psychopathology. But even Freud is really, he would never want to admit this, ultimately just stealing that from the Bible. It says we must live in the truth. We must be in truth. If we deny the reality of a situation, if we deny what is right, what is true, we create hell for ourselves. So, The Road Less Traveled, Scott Peck, and then also his book, People of the Lie. So, a book about human evil. And I see Jordan Peterson, when he came on the scene in 2016, echoing a lot of the same things that I would hear from Scott Peck's books. So, I really did admire Jordan Peterson, because here's someone who you would think would be just as liberal as everyone else is these days, but he spoke up. So of course I'll get into that in this remaining part of the video. Please enjoy. When I was writing my story for the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice for the Journal of Human Sexuality, they also wanted me to include some specific advice to students, graduate students. So I included this part near the end. I actually hesitate to give advice to students, partly because of the uniqueness of my experience, but also because I predict my advice will not be palatable to many people. Perhaps not even some members of the Alliance. I hope the example I have demonstrated makes my advice quite evident. Speak the truth. I do not recommend this lightly. The whole time I was going through what I went through, I believed that the truth was on my side, and even though it might have incriminated me in some ways, I was willing to speak it. And that's what led me to say the thing that probably got me in the most trouble, when I said, if it became illegal, I would practice civil disobedience. And that's the truth. Because I know at my core that what I was doing is right, and I'm actually helping people. And so just because someone made a law against it doesn't mean I'm going to stop helping people. So yeah, that put me in hot water. And so that advice may not be what you want to hear. After my lawyers and I met with the school, and it became increasingly more apparent that they would not decide in my favor, I began inquiring with some Christian universities in case I would have to transfer. And so at one of the universities, one of the professors, as I met with him and all the faculty, and they're deciding whether or not they're going to take me on, and I'm at their mercy essentially, one of the professors told me it was unwise of me to include in my biography my experience in working with men with unwanted same-sex attraction, and essentially that I brought my expulsion upon myself. I am certain that there are people reading my account who share this sentiment. Like, you could have avoided all this if you just would have not shared that part about you. You could still do the work, but you don't have to tell people that you work with people with unwanted same-sex attraction. And so this professor, he has his own counseling practice, and he was telling me, at my counseling practice, we work with people with unwanted same-sex attraction, but we never advertise it. We never say that we do that. And respectfully, I disagreed with him. Granted, if my goal was only to survive graduate school unscathed, I definitely was unwise. For I knew that every time I spoke up in class, or wrote about my convictions and the work I do, that I was risking academic and possibly career suicide. I'm not ignorant. I knew what I was doing was risky. But this professor explained that he's willing to work with clients with unwanted SSA, but they would never advertise that they do this type of counseling because of this concern that it'll get them in hot water. And I consider this almost as great a travesty as the multiple forms of discrimination against our profession and clientele. How will potential clients seeking professional help know where the help is? Our practice has not yet been outlawed entirely. I'm not talking about people who maybe are in Canada or France or parts of Australia where it definitely is outlawed. So yes, you have to be a little wiser, a little more careful in what you do and how you say things. But even though we have certain bans in the U.S., they're only for minors. Majority of my clients are adults, vast majority. So this chilling effect that we've allowed the bans to have for minors, that we're now scared to do good therapy for adults with unwanted same-sex attraction, is a result of our own cowardice. All right? Clients are looking for help. How will they know where to look if therapists aren't going to say, this is one of the things I do. Here's how I do this. Here's how I help someone with unwanted same-sex attraction. We have to be able to put ourselves out there and be willing to fight this fight. That requires a bit of a temperament that most therapists don't have. A lot of therapists have more of an agreeable temperament. They try to be kind, they like to process things. To be in this field, you do have to have a backbone. You need to be a fighter as well as someone who's compassionate and kind. So God had to shape those traits into me over time. That's not easy to come by. A lot of our therapists don't have that temperament, but God can instill it in you because this is what you'll need in these dark times we're facing. So it bothered me as I reflected on it. I said, why are my colleagues working in the daytime as if it is night? It's not yet illegal. Don't act like it's illegal when it's not yet. All right? Let's do good work and openly so that people know there's hope. A year after my ordeal in graduate school, my resolve to speak the truth, no matter the consequences, was further encouraged by an unlikely source. A psychology professor from the University of Toronto, Jordan Peterson, posted a video on YouTube decrying a proposed bill, C-16, that would compel speech by use of transgender and non-binary people's preferred pronouns. I say unlikely because it is well known how left-leaning Canada is, and how left-leaning the psychology world is. So I found it quite inspiring that a psychology professor from Canada was speaking out against the agenda of the radical left and the overreach of LGBT activism. Even more inspiring is how consistent Peterson was being with the content of his lectures, many of which he had already been posting on YouTube over the years. I have found that Peterson has been echoing much of the same counsel Scott Peck had been giving since the 1970s and 1980s with his seminal work, The Road Less Traveled, and then People of the Lie. Both of these clinicians had been concerned with the nature of evil. Peterson in particular had been studying the development of totalitarian regimes and the role of ideology. Both understood that reality by nature is suffering, but deceit and malevolence are what make it unbearable. Both concluded that the solution to oppressive hierarchies and human malevolence was at its core theological and spiritual. They realized that the alternative to pathological ideology was an individual growth, by each person taking responsibility and speaking the truth, in both words and actions. As Peck said, mental health is an ongoing process of dedication to reality at all costs. And, for truth is reality, that which is false is unreal. And after Peterson's original video on Bill C-16 sparked a wildfire of controversy, he appeared in a caravan of videos online preaching about the importance and power of speaking the truth, that the capacity for speech is divine. Speaking truth is what brings order to chaos. The truth is what redeems the world from hell. Peterson often cites Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, noting how Solzhenitsyn came to realize how he himself contributed to the rise of the Soviet Union and its atrocities simply by remaining quiet and silent. Therefore, Peterson's 8th rule for life is to tell the truth, or at least do not lie. So that's my hard pill to swallow for students. The following are some practical suggestions for total dedication to truth in the university. If your professors or classmates assert that SOCI and safety are ineffective or harmful, first ask that they define their terminology, especially when they use terms like conversion therapy and reparative therapy. Then require that they provide the evidence, not just citations, but what the studies actually demonstrated. Familiarize yourself with the research, particularly the studies that show the effectiveness of safety, so that you can correct misinformation. If you are still uncertain yourself about the value of safety, then remember that the APA has admitted that there is not enough data to determine whether or not this therapy is effective or harmful. Use that concession as grounds to challenge the sentiment that the verdict is in. Instead, appeal to true scientific minds by calling for more sophisticated research to be conducted. And if you personally benefited from SOCI or safety, share your story. However, I do caution against doing so if you are still early in your recovery process. Objectors will be at a disadvantage in trying to rebut you, and you may also be influential in eroding their prejudices. As a student, whether in graduate school, college, or even grade school, or even as a professional, you may believe that it is not safe to speak up or take a stand for truth, that you will finally speak up once you are in a position of power. By then, it may be too late, and you will eventually realize that it is never truly safe to speak the truth. Some people have heard my story and told me it felt like a nightmare. Others rejoiced with me because it ultimately ended well for me. However, I was prepared for it to not end well for me. Even now, as what I do is in constant dispute, I understand that I am not entirely out of the woods yet and may never be. Though I thank God that this year, here we are 10 years later, and now this year the Supreme Court has decided to hear the case of Kaylee Childs, who's disputing Colorado's SOCI ban. And if they decide in our favor, that undoes all the bans across the country as being unconstitutional, because they violate the rights of clients to get the therapy that goes along with their values. And so it's a violation of free speech. So that's one big development. At the time, I was like, hey, things keep getting worse, and they may get worse. I have no idea. I got to prepare for either outcome. Let me continue. If you are to speak the truth, there are some things to keep in mind. First, we must always hold truth, as best we can determine it, to be more important, more vital to our self-interest than our comfort. That's from Scott Peck. Total dedication to truth requires a willingness to be challenged, as well as a willingness to let go of the consequences. When I briefly faced the dilemma of whether or not to be open about this aspect of my life, when I was getting ready for applying for graduate school, I was not just choosing how I would present myself in graduate school. I was choosing a trajectory for my life. With every lie or withholding of truth that we come to accept, we grow more comfortable with living in a false reality, living in lies, until we get to the point of being in a mass of prisoners with just a few armed guards. We could overthrow them, but everyone is too scared to be the first one shot at. In speaking up, you act in the faith, the trust, that nothing brings a better world into being than the stated truth. Yes, you risk paying a price for speaking up, but it will never be safe to not speak either. To not advocate for client rights, to not demand scientific integrity and inquiry. If you find yourself outed, whether it was on your terms or not, then consider it an opportunity to stand your ground. Do not apologize for holding unpopular beliefs or even just desiring to investigate the facts on homosexuality and safety, or reparative therapy or conversion therapy. Instead, practice articulating your beliefs, even if they are still in the process of formulation and they are open to revision. The benefit of speaking the truth is that your ideas, as well as the ideas of others, can be corrected where necessary, because you're loyal to truth, not to your opinion. I understand that telling the truth may result in your own sacrifice, but speak the truth you must. And consider the outcome, whatever it may be, to be the best possible outcome. Secondly, do not believe that you are alone. When you speak up, you will discover allies, and you will inspire others to take a stand as well. I was overwhelmed by the support I received from my family, my church, my clients and group members, my internship site, my lawyers, my employer, the Restored Hope Network, the Alliance, and various other therapists that I knew. You may even find unlikely allies. Like we've been seeing with the trans issue, we're seeing very unlikely allies, gays and straights. And uh, yes, I don't like some of the alliances in some ways, but hey, I'll take it for the time being. The current sociopolitical zeitgeist is one in which classical liberals and libertarians are now joining forces with conservatives. There were people who heard my story who expressed disagreement with my values but were reasonable enough to acknowledge how the school wrongly discriminated against me and my clients. So yeah, I had friends tell me, "Oh, my friend is super pro-gay," but they said, "No, this is wrong. This shouldn't be restricting what type of counseling someone can receive." Finally, if you speak the truth, do so with wisdom. The more you understand your life's mission, the more accurately you can calculate the risks. Whether or not I completed graduate school, I still had a secure job to provide for myself and my wife. Not to mention, I have other talents I could find a way to monetize. And even if I could not obtain my degree, I would not be deterred from continuing to do lay counseling in some form or another. I encourage you to network and establish a support system in advance of any potential conflicts. Identify and utilize advocacy groups such as the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity, and Equality and Justice for All. Familiarize yourself with the various constitutional and religious liberty legal funds. I recommend consulting lawyers as soon as you realize your rights or your client's rights may be endangered by your school. In hindsight, do I regret being open about my work in this field? No. After so much time to reflect, I have no regrets. I am at peace, and I'm eager to share my story. You probably have heard me share aspects of it in multiple places, but this is the definitive version with the most detail you'll get anywhere else. So I hope that this encourages you to be bold, to be wise, to be diligent, be willing to take risks, because there are people who need your help as a clinician, as a ministry leader. And it's going to take a risk at your own sacrifice to provide that help to them. But it will be worth it. And Jesus risked it all for us. So like I say at the end of all my videos, please remember that Jesus loves you freely, fully, faithfully, and fruitfully. Take care.